In this video, we are going to explore how the concentration of glucose in our blood is carefully controlled by two very important hormones called insulin and glucagon, and by the end of the explanation, we will also understand how these hormones work together in a system known as a negative feedback loop. Now, when we say blood glucose concentration, we are simply referring to the amount of sugar or glucose that is circulating in our bloodstream at any given time. Our cells need a constant and reliable supply of glucose in order to carry out respiration, which is the process that releases energy to keep us alive. However, if the level of glucose in our blood becomes too high, it can start to harm tissues and organs, which is why it is so important to keep this level within a healthy range, not too high and not too low. Imagine you eat a large meal that contains a lot of carbohydrates, such as bread, rice, or pasta. These carbohydrates are broken down during digestion into smaller glucose molecules, which are then absorbed into the bloodstream through the walls of the intestines. As a result, the glucose level in the blood rises quite sharply. We can show this on a graph where the x-axis shows time and the y-axis shows the concentration of blood glucose. Before eating the meal, the glucose levels are relatively stable and close to the normal value, but after eating there is a spike in glucose levels due to the absorption of sugar from the food. This increase is detected by a special organ called the pancreas, which lies just behind the stomach. In response to the rising glucose levels, the pancreas releases a hormone called insulin into the bloodstream. As insulin travels through the blood, it binds to receptors found on the surface of various body cells. This binding signals those cells to absorb some of the glucose from the blood. The liver and muscle cells are particularly important in this process because they take in a large amount of the extra glucose and convert it into a storage form called glycogen, which is essentially a long chain made of glucose units. Since more and more glucose is being removed from the blood and stored away, the overall concentration of glucose in the blood begins to fall. Looking again at our graph, we would now see a downward curve that returns back toward the normal glucose level. So we now understand how the body lowers high blood glucose levels, but we also need a way to deal with the opposite problem, which is when the glucose level becomes too low. This is where the hormone glucagon comes in. Do not confuse glucagon with glycogen, even though they sound similar. Glucagon is a hormone, while glycogen is the storage molecule made of glucose. Glucagon is also made and released by the pancreas, but it has the opposite effect of insulin. Rather than lowering blood glucose levels, it works to raise them. If, for example, you skipped breakfast and have been active all morning, your blood glucose levels might drop too low. In that case, the pancreas will detect the dip and release glucagon into the blood. As this glucagon travels through the body, it binds mainly to liver cells. These liver cells then respond by breaking down the stored glycogen back into glucose. This glucose is then released into the blood, which increases the glucose concentration and brings it back to normal. This means our cells can continue to get the glucose they need for respiration. When we look at insulin and glucagon together, we can see that they form a classic negative feedback loop. Whenever the blood glucose level gets too high, insulin is released to bring it down. But if the glucose level drops too low, glucagon is released to bring it back up. This system keeps repeating itself automatically to maintain the balance. In practice, the body constantly monitors glucose levels and keeps switching between releasing insulin and glucagon depending on whether the levels need to be decreased or increased. This is why blood glucose concentration is not a straight constant line, but instead continuously fluctuates slightly around a healthy set point. And that is how our bodies manage to keep blood sugar under control using these two powerful hormones.